It began with a roar, a deep, thunderous rumble that cracked the air over northern Ukraine in the middle of the night. People in the nearby town of Pripyat shot out of bed, staring out their windows at a strange bluish glow spreading across the horizon. It looked like dawn, but this wasn't sunrise. It was something else. Something no one fully understood yet. Something that would change their lives and history forever. At 1:23 a.m. on April 26, 1986, Reactor 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. But this wasn't a natural disaster. It wasn't war, sabotage, or an act of terror. It was a test, just a test, and one colossal mistake. For years, the Soviet Union had promoted nuclear power with pride. Nuclear plants symbolized modernity, strength, and progress. Chernobyl, located just 10 miles from the Belarus border, was one of the shining stars. A powerful RBMK reactor capable of lighting up entire cities, boilers of the future, built on Soviet confidence. But behind that confidence was a flaw, a hidden crack in the steel mask. On the night of the disaster, engineers had been ordered to run a safety test, a simulation. They wanted to see if in the event of a power outage, the spinning turbines could generate enough electricity to keep cooling systems running until backup generators kicked in. It was a critical question. If the coolant failed, the reactor could overheat. But there was a catch. The test had already failed once before, and this time, corners were cut. Safety systems were disabled. Protocols were ignored. And the reactor itself? It was unstable, already at dangerously low power, the worst possible state for such an experiment. The operators didn't know that, or perhaps they did, but were under pressure to follow through. So they pressed forward. And then, everything went wrong. Inside Reactor 4, the chain reaction went wild. The graphite control rods, meant to slow the reaction, backfired due to a fatal design flaw, briefly accelerating it instead. The pressure skyrocketed, the water boiled into steam, and then, boom! A massive explosion tore through the 1,000-ton steel lid of the reactor core. A second explosion followed, blasting radioactive debris into the atmosphere. Red-hot graphite rained down on the roof, flames lit the sky. Of the plant workers and first responders nearby, many had no idea they were walking into a nuclear inferno. They grabbed hoses, ran toward the wreckage, and tried to fight it like a normal fire. Some even stood on top of the blown-out core as lethal gamma rays bombarded their bodies. Within hours, some would collapse. Within weeks, many would be dead. But in those early hours, the rest of the world remained blissfully unaware. In Pripyat, life continued, almost normally. Children went to school. Couples strolled the streets. The Ferris wheel stood ready for the May Day celebration. No one warned them. The Soviet leadership hesitated. Denial, confusion, fear. For 36 hours after the explosion, local residents were left to breathe radioactive air, drink contaminated water, and let fallout settle on their skin. Finally, buses rolled in. 50,000 people were told to pack for a short trip. Just a precaution, officials said. No need to panic. They never returned. Even then, the scale of the disaster wasn't fully known. Nuclear radiation is invisible, odorless, silent, but deadly. It wasn't until 2 days later, when sensors at a Swedish nuclear plant picked up abnormal radiation levels, that the truth began to emerge. A Soviet reactor had exploded. A radioactive cloud was drifting across Europe, and the world realized something terrible had happened in Chernobyl. By then, it was too late. Firefighters, plant workers, and helicopter crews were battling the disaster around the clock. Helicopters dropped sand, clay, and boron onto the burning core, trying to smother the radioactive blaze. But it wasn't enough. The core was buried deep and seething with deadly heat. Then, a terrifying possibility came to light. Beneath the melted reactor lay a vast pool of water, part of the plant's cooling system. If molten nuclear fuel reached it, it could cause a second, even larger explosion, one that might devastate much of Europe. A team of volunteers, 3 men, dove into the flooded basement in total darkness, risking everything to open the drainage valves. Their names? Valery Bespalov, Alexei Ananenko, and Boris Baranov. For years, they were believed to have died. In truth, 2 of them survived. They saved millions. But the danger wasn't over. Not even close. Authorities soon realized the radioactive core had melted through the reactor floor and was continuing to burn, in what would later be known as the elephant's foot, a lava-like mass emitting deadly radiation levels. A few seconds near it meant certain death. More than 600,000 people, known as liquidators, were sent in to try to contain the fallout. Soldiers, miners, engineers, fire crews, many with no idea what kind of invisible killer they were up against. They bulldozed trees, demolished buildings, buried vehicles and animals, and constructed a giant sarcophagus to entomb the reactor. But the sarcophagus was a rush job, cracking, leaking, and it wouldn't last forever. Chernobyl was becoming more than a disaster. It was a haunting reminder. The atom, split in pursuit of progress, had now turned on its creators. And the cost, ecological, human, political, was only beginning to show. Let's pause here, because this story doesn't end with the explosion or the evacuation. It didn't just shake the ground, it shook an empire. And what came next would shift the course of the USSR and the world. The Soviet Union had always thrived on control. Control of information, control of perception, control of truth. But Chernobyl shattered the illusion. In the weeks after the disaster, Soviet citizens began hearing whispers, rumors that contradicted official statements. Hospitals filled with patients suffering from acute radiation sickness. Helicopters crashed over the site, eaten alive by radiation. Animals dropped dead by the roadside. And sprawling exclusion zones were drawn on maps, places that would remain uninhabitable for hundreds, if not thousands of years. People started asking questions. Why weren't we warned? Who's really responsible? Inside the Kremlin, panic simmered beneath a surface of forced calm. Mikhail Gorbachev, then only a year into his role as leader of the Soviet Union, found himself trapped. He couldn't fully reveal the truth without unraveling the myth of infallibility that had been built for generations. But he also couldn't contain Western eyes from watching. Satellites snapped images of the destroyed reactor. Western media ran stories daily. Foreign governments demanded answers. Chernobyl had gone global, and the curtain of secrecy had been pulled wide open. That exposure did something the West had never managed through decades of Cold War. It cracked the heart of the Soviet system from within. Gorbachev's hand was forced. Reforms that were already in motion, like glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, accelerated. Suddenly, state-run news outlets could no longer deny the catastrophe. Scientists and journalists began publishing real data. Survivors spoke out. For the first time, Soviet citizens were having a national conversation about government failure, and the government was listening, or at least pretending to. Meanwhile, cleanup efforts pressed on, but it was like trying to sweep breadcrumbs off a landmine. Every inch of soil, every wall and rooftop carried microscopic poisons. Liquidators worked in shifts of just minutes. Some had only cloth masks. Others were told to run fast and not look at the reactor. Animals were hunted, forests incinerated, entire villages abandoned. Roads went nowhere, ending abruptly at barbed wire fences. Time itself seemed to stop inside the zone. The people who once lived in Pripyat left everything. Photos, toys, wedding dresses, even their pets. The city is still frozen today, crumbling under vines and dust. A ghost town trapped in 1986. The aftermath wasn't just local. Thyroid cancer cases began rising in children across Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. Contaminated food made it into supermarkets. The land around Chernobyl became a patchwork of hotspots, where radiation levels change across inches. A forest turned red from exposure. A river glowed at night. And though no one could prove how many lives were cut short, estimates range into the tens or even hundreds of thousands when long-term effects are considered. The numbers are murky, but the pain was real. The Soviet Union tried to move on. They rebuilt the energy grid. They patched together a fragile sarcophagus over Reactor 4. But the psychological wound was harder to treat. Trust in the system, already strained, was crumbling. By 1989, the Iron Curtain was rusting. Nationalist movements surged across the USSR. Protests erupted for transparency and independence. People demanded to know what else had been hidden. How many more Chernobyls were waiting in the dark? 2 years later, the Soviet Union fell. Gorbachev would later claim that Chernobyl, more than anything else, more than Reagan, more than politics, was the real catalyst for the end of the USSR. A single reactor had done what nuclear weapons never could. It didn't destroy the country with fire, it dissolved its faith. But Chernobyl's story didn't end with a flag coming down. In the decades that followed, the zone remained closed. But it drew people in. Scientists, filmmakers, daredevils, illicit tour guides, even wildlife, in the absence of humans, returned in force. Wolves, bears, wild horses. The land was poisoned, but life found a way. In 2016, a massive new structure, the new safe confinement, was slid over the old sarcophagus. A $2.1 billion feat of engineering designed to seal the reactor for at least 100 years. A century-long band-aid over an open wound. And yet, Chernobyl remains a warning, a reminder of what happens when pride overrides precaution, when politics buries science, when systems designed to protect us fail us instead. In recent years, the site has re-entered headlines. In 2020, wildfires swept through the exclusion zone, stirring up radioactive ash into the atmosphere. In 2022, during Russia's invasion of Ukraine, armed soldiers entered the Chernobyl zone, digging trenches in contaminated soil, unknowingly exposing themselves to dangerous radiation. Once again, the silence of the zone was broken by boots and bullets. Because Chernobyl isn't just history, it's still very much alive, in memory, in environment, and in cautionary whispers traded between nations. So what's the legacy? Is it the loss of life? The abandoned city? The cancer? The political fallout? Maybe it's all of those things, but also something more. Chernobyl stands as a symbol of hubris and heroism, of ideology clashing with reality, of ordinary people, firefighters, divers, engineers, showing extraordinary courage when the system faltered. It's a place where humanity gambled with forces it barely understood and paid the price. There's a line from one of the cleanup workers years later. He said, "We weren't heroes. We were just trying to stop the nightmare." And maybe that's why we have to keep telling this story, because nightmares only grow in silence, and the cost of forgetting is far more dangerous than radiation.